Ethnography is a very complicated thing, and this gives you some ideas about how we have to be aware of what we're really doing. Second stage, starting in the early part of the 20th century, a stage we now call cultural relativism, no longer looking at people as being primitive, but looking at people as living in different conceptual worlds with no sense that one world is better than another. And this is probably the most famous part of ethnography, of anthropology. Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture and The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, famous books trying to present different cultures as different patterns of being human in the world. On a cultural level, not on a personal level, and treating each of them equally. Margaret Mead, famous ethnographer of the South Seas, New Guinea, wrote a series of books in the 20s and 30s, and then on into the 50s, basically pushing the idea that the West is not the measure of the world, even though the West is economically more developed, that other societies have equal weight. Third stage, this is in the 1950s, 1960s, what we now call development anthropology, where intellectually they were looking at the ways in which people's attitudes shift in the process of economic development. Now, they called it the process of modernization, which is not a term we use at this point. It implied a particular theoretical approach to modernization. If you want to get that, read W.W. Rostow. This book is by Alex Inkelis, and which is the psychological look at how people are psychologically different in modern world than they are in a traditional world. And that's the division they kept, tradition versus modern. Ethnographically, you had people like George and Louise Spindler who just explored the psychological and social discontinuities in culture change. They did it among the Menominee Indians in Wisconsin in the US and in South Germany. I worked with them in South Germany when I was a student. These are my teachers. And Ben Paul was working in Guatemala. Ben and Lois Paul worked there in the village of Santiago Altitlan for something like 45 years. Anyway, that's the old style ethnography. And the new style began in about 1970 with a realization that ethnographers coming from the West had a limited way of understanding other people in other parts of the world. Clifford Geertz introduced the notion of interpretive ethnography, where the job of the ethnographer is to understand how other people see the world and translate it into something that can be understood outside their culture. And so he's got a series of books on Java, Morocco, and then a series of brilliant essays pushing that particular approach. In the 1980s, anthropologists, they're not sociologists, anthropologists began to recognize their own complicity in the colonial process. And this is the point where people put two and two together and discovered, oh, right, Evans Pritchard worked for the British Foreign Office. And we have to see to what degree his particular job and his approach shaped what his conclusions were. Same thing for the folks in the first set. These are three prominent anthropologists of this period, and the works to read here are Europe and the People Without History, which is a serious critique of the conceit that Europe has history and nobody else does. And that's the division between tradition and modern that's been part of Eurocentric social theory for a long time. Tal al-Assad's Genealogies of Religion, which is a critique of the very concept of religion itself as a Western imposition. And Arjun Appadurai, Modernity at Large, looking at the shifts in consciousness that occur in a global society that is modern, but also modern that's located in particular places. Now, these are mainly theoretical works, but each one of these folks did very detailed work in particular places. And then the sixth stage is what we call a focus on representation. And the book that I did with a bunch of sociologists in 2002 focused on this. The notion here, it looks at the second half of that two-prong ethnographer's job. One is we go and investigate the lives of other people. And the second one is we then come back and we try to represent that to other people, to people. And so these folks looked at the writing process and how does the writing process shape what our readers can understand about what's going on. Here are some examples. Edmund Leach's Political Systems of Highland Burma, written in the late 1940s, took a look, a very close look at the Kachin Society of Highland Burma. And he's describing it. He's describing how their politics work, how their culture works. Fascinating details, but he presumes himself as an outsider, presumes that he has a better vision of what the Kachin do than they really did themselves. The new ethnography, here's just a couple of cases. Matt Hamabata did a brilliant study of a Japanese business family, a family that owned a small corporation in Japan. And he showed how culture affects business life and daily life. And it was both behavior and the way in which people see things. And in the case of the Japanese, it was all of the things they don't tell you. So he has this beautiful description of walking into a meeting, and he's invited to the meeting, and there's only one chair in the room left, and so he sits in it. And Matt is Japanese American. He's American, his English is his native language, but he looks Japanese. And he'd been spent time there, and so everyone had forgotten he was American. He sat down in this empty chair, and you could hear this collective gasp from everybody in the room, because that was the chair reserved for the highest status person who had not yet arrived. And at that point, Matt realized what he'd done, turned to the person next to him and said something in English, at which point everyone in the room began to breathe again, because, oh yeah, it's just a gaijin. We keep forgetting he's not Japanese. He doesn't know this stuff. And they forgave him. Now, that little episode tells you something really important about that particular culture. And so it's a process of description, but it's also a very interesting way of translating how that works. You find these things in all of these particular cases. Now, the difference here, and this is really the important part for knowing a bit about the old style ethnographers imagined they could attain a God's eye view of the people they studied. The new style ethnographers know that they cannot do that it's not possible to do that. The old style ethnographers often, not always, but often forgot that they too had a social location. And so Frank Cushing goes into Zuni Pueblo and walks into the governor's house and sets up his hammock between two pillars and stays there for 2 years. The governor is actually what we would call a foreign minister. So his job is to keep the colonial power, i.e. the United States, off of Zuni's back. He can't throw the guy out. I mean, if someone walked into our house and my house and set up a hammock, I'd have them out the door relatively quickly. But the Zuni did not have the power to do that, and they knew it. So they had to figure out a way to work with this. Cushing never realized that he had a sort of social position and that social power. And so that shapes everything that he wrote about them, even though he didn't realize it. New style ethnographers recognize that their social location shapes what they can see. And that's really the message, that at this point, there's no excuse for us as ethnographers not recognizing that what we bring with us into the field shapes what we can see. And it's not just who we are as individuals, but what is our particular social position? How does our way of seeing the world shape what we're able to encounter? So that's the history. And I'm going to bring my clock down here so that I can see it on my screen. Now, I'm going to start with that slide again, because that's the key point in my second section of the talk. That the real key here is what sociology, what as ethnographers call reflexivity. And this is how you can figure it out. I'm a photographer, so this one works for me, but I think it works for other people as well. Doing ethnography is like using a camera. You've probably all used cameras. You point them at something. You've got, at this point, either a plastic or a glass lens in the front of the camera. You have light that comes in through that lens and falls either on, currently it falls on a digital sensor for most people. Some people, they still use film. They used to use glass plates. First photographers used asphalt, and light falling on asphalt creates an image, et cetera, et cetera. Those of you who have taken a picture of friends and a family at an event recognize that you're seeing what you see is really there. You folks are really seeing me in my office through this camera. You're really seeing Afa through in front of you in his office. That's real, it's objective. But you can't see the stuff that's off to the side. I've got junk in that direction and junk in that direction that I'm not letting you see. You can't see what's behind you. The camera doesn't see behind itself unless you got one of those 360-degree cameras, and their optics aren't all that good. So it's like using a camera. The camera photographs what it sees, but it doesn't see in all directions. And that's just like ethnographers. It does see what you pointed at. And where you stand shapes what you can point at, and therefore it shapes your photo. Well, ethnography is the same thing. It involves seeing from a standpoint. You can't see everything. You must learn how your standpoint shapes your vision. So somebody asked about doing research in their own congregation or in their own denomination. That's fine, but where you stand in your official position in that denomination or in that congregation is going to shape what is able to appear in front of your camera and what is not. Doesn't mean you can't find out things, but it means you have to know what you can't see. And so the key question for an ethnographer is, what does your standpoint prevent you from seeing? Better to work at it backwards. Now, what shapes standpoint? Here's a bunch of stuff that shapes standpoint. This is not an exhaustive list. The fact that I'm 72 years old shapes my standpoint on a bunch of things, because I remember growing up in the shadow of World War II and the shadow of the defeat of fascism. That made a huge difference. Gender shapes a lot. Social class, race and ethnicity, culture, religion and theology shape who we are. We all know that. Not all sociologists know that, but we know that. And it shapes us in ways of which we are not always totally aware at the beginning of our investigations. Nation shapes that. Era shapes that. We live in a different world now than we lived in 20 years ago, than we lived in 40 years ago. And those eras shape what we find interesting. They shape what our history is, etc. Those are the social historical elements shaping standpoint. And of course, as I said, this is not an exhaustive list. It is but it is a list, and you're welcome to add things to it. But then each one of us individually has shapings. Coming from the particular family from which I come shaped me. Having the particular experience of marriage and the death of my first wife and the two particular children I have and the remarriage and all of those things shaped who I am and what I see. Just a side note, I wrote a book called Alternative Sociologies of Religion, and the Confucian approach to the sacred, the Confucian approach to almost anything, puts that first, puts this family shapings, at the notion of we are constructed by our relationships and therefore we have to take those into account. A Confucian ethnographer would never mistake their own position for a universal position. Education, life experience, personality, friends, chance. You know, I met Afa some 20 years ago at a conference in Aarhus, Denmark. And he was there with his graduate, his mentor. And then they both invited me to Bayreuth, and we all three hit it off. And Afa and I are, have roomed together at conferences. Afa has changed my standpoint on things. And that is just the way it is. And yet I have to take that into account. So you have social, historical, and personal shapings. That's things that shape your standpoint. All of those will shape what you can see in the field and what you can bring out of it. You need to recognize how your standpoint shapes your vision and so on. Now, this became particularly live in the 13 years of field work I did with the Los Angeles Catholic Worker. And I'm not going to go into great detail, although I probably will stick an article in the Dropbox. I've got one in there already that does a little bit of that, but I'll stick a longer article. The Los Angeles Catholic Worker is a radical Catholic, it's a lay Catholic movement. It's a radical Catholic movement founded by Dorothy Day in the 1930s as a combination of very Orthodox Catholicism and left-wing politics. Dorothy Day's perhaps apocryphal comment is that the thing Catholics most have to do is take down this dirty, filthy, rotten social system that makes people poor and that causes wars and oppresses folks and so on. Los Angeles is one of the most active Catholic worker communities. Began in 1969. It's a commune. They live in a big building up on a big house up in the eastern side of Los Angeles. It's an impoverished neighborhood. And they run a soup kitchen down on Skid Row, which is the poorest area in Los Angeles. And it's the area where every night 5,000 people sleep out on the streets because they have no place to live. And they've run a soup kitchen down there since the early 60s, or about late 60s, I think. And they do work with the poor, but it's accompanying their friends on the street. They are not trying to rescue the poor. They're trying to make life possible for people. And then when they're not working with the poor, they're spending their time protesting the United States' long history of whatever war the US is in, they're out there protesting it. And they are, many of them have arrest records, long arrest records for various activities. 1991, I started an interview project with religious social activists trying to find out what did the religious social activists, people who've been long-term religious social activism, how did they describe the relationship between their spiritual lives and their activist lives? And the reality is it was all over the map. I interviewed 60, 70 people, and no two answers were alike, and it was fascinating work. But I interviewed several of these folks, and then I started coming to Mass at their Wednesday night Mass at their house, just because it was very cool thing to do, and I enjoyed it. And over the next 13 years, I would take my students down to Mass, and we'd interact with the community, and we'd have a very unusual Mass. And then they'd take soup, blessed soup, and they'd take it out on the street to serve it to the homeless folks that they spent their time in serving. Somewhere around, I was just fascinated. It ended up becoming an ethnography project. And the issue that enlivened me was, how do they maintain what seems like a hopeless activist task? That is, there were 5,000 people sleeping on the streets of Skid Row, that area of Los Angeles, when they started. And there are still 5,000 people sleeping on the streets of Skid Row today, despite the city having voted to tax itself $1 trillion to abolish homelessness. I think by last year was when it was supposed to all be spent, but it certainly hasn't been spent. And the problem is there are more people in the streets, more people in housing, but there are more people on the streets. And how do you maintain the energy and the enthusiasm for doing this work, not only when the civil authorities are constantly getting in your way, but when your own church's authorities are getting in your way and trying to stop what it is you're doing, even though you are acting out Catholic social teachings to your eyes quite well. And so I was looking at that and thought, well, how do they do this? And the short answer is they have a very rich ritual life, and that Wednesday evening Mass is part of it. And so I did a piece of phenomenological ethnography, and I tracked the experiences of people as they go to that Mass, and as it refreshes them and reforms the community and reforms in them the emotions that produce a sense of dedication. As I say, I'll stick that one in the Dropbox because it's worth thinking about. But the point here is that everything I saw there and took notes on actually happened. This was not a subjective activity, it was an objective activity. But I'm the one that pointed my own internal camera. And I'm the one that chose what part of the community life to work on based on what I thought was important. And it took me 15 years after the field work was over, 10, 15 years after the field work was over, for me to realize that it had been my own theological wrestling with the issue of how you maintain an activist commitment and how you find the spiritual strength to do that. That's what led me to ask that question. I think I found the answer I found there among them was, I think, right. Because I spent the entire last year of my field work checking to make sure it was right. That is, I've been doing field work for 12 years, and it's like, okay, I think this is what's going on. And you go to informants and you look and you watch the process. And it was the spot at which that ritual, Wednesday evening ritual, changed slightly but significantly, that I realized, yeah, I got it right. So my conclusions are they're good descriptions of what was there, but my own theology pointed me in that particular direction, and I could not see I couldn't present the entire place. Some of the Catholic work for folks wished that I pointed the camera in a different direction. Not that I criticized them, but that they thought there were more important things to look at. And that's what the deal with ethnography is. Now, this particular book, Office Read, I suggest you go find it. It's written to bring the reflexive turn to the ethnography of religion especially to sociologists and religious studies scholars, because they hadn't, at the time this book came out, they hadn't read recent anthropology. Now, there's been more recent anthropology, and some folks are now on what's they call the ontological turn, which I've read a lot of, and I don't think they're right about it, but we're not talking about that today. Here are the skills that you need in order to do ethnography well. You need to be able to listen to people. And by listening to people, it means listening to what they're saying, not what you're imagining they're saying. As I said in the last lecture, you have to be absolutely surprised at some point in your, if you're just completely flabbergasted, or else you haven't gotten out of your own head enough to really what's going on. You have to recognize your own cultural baggage. And by cultural baggage, I mean that's both that standpoint, the history that's the social historical things that have shaped you and the personal things that have shaped you, because that's going to determine what you can and can't see. And once you recognize it, then you have to be able to say, okay, let me question the thing that I brought into the field, find out whether that's getting in the way of my seeing things. It helps to be willing to be vulnerable. That's a psychological trait. If you're able to be vulnerable, it's easier to do some of this stuff. And you also have to be willing to stand up to your own cultural and theological presumptions and put them under the microscope to decide whether they're valid. If you do ethnography in a religious setting correctly, you will probably have a crisis of faith. Good. You will come out of it, maybe different than you were, but you will be challenged if you let yourself be challenged. I certainly was. And it made a lot of difference. These are more important than mere technique. There's the question. Ask, what am I not seeing? And why am I not seeing it? All right, we'll do a little bit about doing ethnography because I think that folks really want to know something about this one. What do ethnographers do? This is another one of my teachers, and he described ethnography as deep hanging out. That is, you go into a place and you just hang out there. You do stuff. You talk to people. You don't go in and out. It's the things that you notice when you're not supposed to be doing anything that really give you the clues. And I highly recommend you read Renato Rosaldo's work as he's describing his process of working in the Highland Philippines among former headhunters who've become fundamentalist Christians. And the issue is, why did they do that? And he tells you, and tells you how he learned, and it's fascinating. You can go here and take a look at research basics, and I've got a whole chapter on ethnography and the various things that ethnographers look at. Look at acts, behavior, and events, look at cultural knowledge, and look at hidden social patterns. Those are the three things this method is perfect for. I'm going to skip this because I talked about this a little bit in the last lecture or in the question period, and it's written about in the text. But I think here, I'll skip that too. I was going to go through this, but I don't think we have time. But the three goals, what do people do? What is their shared understanding of the world, which is their cultural knowledge? And what hidden patterns can we find in their lives? Typo in the last one of those, but ignore the typo. I'm happy to talk about that later, but I'm wanting to leave room for questions, and we don't have tons of room. This is how you take field notes. Now I filled it out. This is in the back of the book. You basically take a piece of paper and you make 4 columns. And on one column, the external details. So, such and such a day, I was down at the Catholic Worker and I was attending Mass, and these are the people who were there. And so was the celebrant. And those were always interesting because usually they would only have a priest if it had been one of the mornings when they were protesting at the federal building and with a priest, and the priest had gotten arrested along with them, and they'd spring him out of jail and he'd come up and do Mass for the community. Otherwise, one of the community members would be celebrant, although it wouldn't be a formal Mass. That's the external stuff. And then the second column is what you observe. These are the detailed list of all of the things you actually see. And the key dividing line is between what I observed and my thoughts about what I observed. And those have to go in 2 separate lists. Because if they don't, when you go back into your field notes, you're going to mix that up. You will have, oh, I had this thought here. Did I see that, or was that from them, or was that from me? And if you use this form, then you can keep that stuff straight. And then as you're in the field, you're going to have these stray thoughts about things that connect, because part of your mind is working on your bigger project, and you can say, I wonder if Schillebeck has something to say about this, and you put that over here in this other ideas, either tame or wild ones, things that you're not really about what you're observing, but they're connections, because you may find later on when you go through your notes that those are significant. When I made this up, 2004, I was teaching in a graduate school that had students all over the world. And one of them was in Japan, and she was in the midst of a very creative project doing an ethnography of a Buto dance group. I won't go into the details about that. But I put this up for my students, and about 15 minutes later, I got an email back from her saying, "Where do you put evil thoughts?" Now, by that, her example was, you're sitting having an interview with somebody, and this little voice comes up in your head that says, this person is lying to me. And you have no evidence for that. But some little warning signal goes, we all have this, we're all familiar with this. You put it over here in this column. It's not something you observed, not something about what you thought you observed. It's something else, because you didn't observe any of that. But you keep track of it. And it may be that maybe this comes up periodically, and you look and see, you write these things so that things line up with when you had the thought, and you may discover, weeks or months later, that every time somebody brings up a particular topic, you get this feeling that they're lying to you, or that they're evading you, or they're not answering your question. And in that case, you may have found a hidden pattern, and you go and investigate it. You inspect it. You don't assume that your first impression is what is really going on, but it says, there's something more going on here that I need to ask about. And I told you already that in the project with the Episcopal group, I knew that the pastor, within 2 days of interviews, the pastor was going to resign after 17 years in his position. Nobody told me. I had no evidence about that. Nobody made any complaints about him, and so on and so on. But they were talking about it as if he had already left. And in fact, that was something going on, but I would not have been able to know it. My own field work didn't uncover it. So if he hadn't resigned, well, it would be okay. I don't know what's going on here, but this is a powerful tool. You must take notes, and half of your time will be taking notes if you're doing a good ethnography. Now, Either that means you develop a very magic memory, or you figure out some way to take notes in person, or you spend a lot of time in the bathroom taking notes in the midst of things, or when you leave the site, you go a little ways away and take notes. When you're doing the data analysis, those notes are important. Now, this one here is slightly different. It's factors identified in the literature as being important. So you do that literature review. And here you're interviewing people, and the literature tells you all of these things are important, and you walk through the interview and you say, okay, this question I know is going to work for this and work for that. This is what they tell you. This one here, what aspects of the job, you get check these off and so on. And that forms a preliminary coding for you based on the literature. The key thing for ethnography or any qualitative data analysis is coding. As I said before, I used to have 3x5 cards spread all over the living room floor or the tables, and the cats were a problem, but when I got kids, that became absolutely impossible. So at this point, the new style coding is, qualitative data analysis software, and there is free qualitative data analysis software, and I can give you the link to that at some point. This one is very expensive. Don't buy this one. It's very good, but somebody else can buy it for you. But that's not, but those are, conceptually speaking, they do exactly the same thing. The QDA software does not give you results. You notice patterns in it. You put the patterns in there. Saying that you're going to take all your notes and throw them in vivo or max QDA and see what patterns emerge is exactly like saying, I'm going to take all these numbers and throw them in a statistics program and see what comes out. No, you have to go do the thought each step of the line. It's very valuable, but then you have to question yourself at the end. Two examples. This is Edmund Leach, Political Systems of Highland Burma. He took very good field notes. And then at the end of his field work, he was fleeing from invading Japanese troops, and all of his field notes were lost in a river crossing, every one of them. And he still wrote Political Systems of Highland Burma. Now, the problem with the book is that it's a little imprecise in places. He hasn't got those anecdotes quite there, although he had a good memory. But you may not have the field notes, and it's going to be a little less precise than you want if that's the case. Here's the other case I mentioned, Alice Goffman. The book is On the Run, and she destroyed her field notes in order to protect her informants. So, ethnography is hard stuff. All right. Now, I'm not going to go through the examples. I'm not going to do the thing on visual ethnography, another time perhaps. And the issue here is your questions. And there's the workshop slides and materials, which I put in the chat already. So if you've connected the chat, you'll have that one. Afa, let's do questions.
No, thank you, Jim, again for this very interesting and deep exposition of what ethnography is. But I think your presentation also makes very clear what ethnography is not. And these questions, are mutually interactive. So we do have now about 10 minutes for Q&A, and without much ado, I will just open it up and we'll follow the same pattern. If you do have a question or commentary, either you raise your hand virtually using the symbol on your system, or you paste your question, and I will try to ensure that Jim has it.
Right. Tayo has one already.
All right. Okay. So I think we have
Babatunde also.
Tayo and Babatunde. Please say where you're coming from. Let's take those first two.
Okay.
And then Jim will respond, and then we'll go to the second level. So Tayo, unmute and then.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, Jim. I agree with you that ethnography is indeed as tough. I've been involved in one during my PhD, and I know looking back into the history of um, ethnography and between the old and the new, the modern way. Um, I saw something of living in the place, the length of time that most of the ethnographers spent staying in the place of their research. And you made mention of Rosaldo's deep hanging out. So my question is basically about the hanging out. How long in the new or modern ethnography should the hanging out be? I know it should be deep because ethnography is deep, but how long should the hanging out be, considering the context that people are in these days and the environment we they are? And sorry, my name is Tayo Weyo from Nigeria.
Okay. Thank
Yes,
you. I
sir.
was going to ask because you may have migrated in 1 hour. So thanks for that. Yes, Tunde, your question or comment, please.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the exposition on ethnography. My question is from the experiential perspective over the years, how do you deal with the issue of data saturation, particularly when you are in a field where you keep on gathering data and you are looking at it from various lenses? Thank you.
Tunde, could you tell us where you are before and now?
Okay, I'm in Nigeria, but currently in UK. Thanks.
Okay. All right, thank you. So Jim, take a shot at that, and then we take a
Oh,
second.
well, and those are related questions. I listed various folks as my teachers. George and Louise Spindler visited the Menominee, spent summers with them for something like 35 years. And they wrote books about them and articles and so on before that. But it turns out by the end of their work, they had to rewrite the book that they'd written halfway through because things had changed and they came to new realizations about things that they'd seen. So that's on the long side. Ben Paul and Lois Paul spent 43 years in San Pedro Atitlan. Not every year, but they spent, they probably during that time, they spent 5 or 6 years on site. And that's not unusual for people. Matilda Stevenson spent, they spent a long time doing this stuff. It's very hard, particularly for graduate students and young professors to do that, but you spend enough time there that you find things that you would never have seen when you were first there. Even though you take notes from the moment you step on the ground so that you will, because sometimes you'll see things when you're first there that won't repeat right away. And you'll really realize later, oh, I've gotten used to this place. George talked at one point to me about going back to the Menominee, and these were his friends, and he hadn't seen them for a while, and he drove up and got out of his car, and a bunch of people were in a front yard watching people play stick game, which is a gambling game. Nobody said a word to him. And he was saying to himself, have I offended them? What's happening? Am I? And after about 15 minutes, one of them turned to him and said, nice to see you, George. I'm glad you're back. And he realized, oh, that's right. They operate much more slowly in interaction than do folks in, Anglo-American society. And you develop those kinds of, you acculturate, and then you come out and you realize, oh my. But being able to go in and go out. Renato and Shelley Rosaldo spent, I think, about 10 years off and on visiting northern Luzon. And Shelley actually died there in a fall off a mountain. And Renato's writing an essay about that, The Headhunter's Rage, is an anthropological classic. Now, data saturation. At some point, you aren't learning anything new and it's gotten a little dry there, and so you need to come out and think. And then you need to go back in and test, and then you come out and think again. There's I'm forgetting the guy's name. There's an ethnography of the Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, which is an old computer corporation, no longer in existence, the anthropologist spent a year in their offices, and he starts the book by describing leaving, because he'd figured out all of the things he could do after a year, and then it was time to pull up, go out, write it up, and move on to something else. So it's flexible. 2 months, it's just too, in my experience, it's too short, and you won't get to the data saturation. Now, the question, of course, is saturation of which data, because that really is a good question. I ended up focusing on a piece of Catholic worker life that I thought was very important and that had not been written about by anybody. So I saturated that at some point, 12 years, but then I wasn't there all the time. But then, and then I checked for the 13th. I think the data was saturated there. If I'd been trying to do a picture of all of them, well, I could still be doing it.
Yes, thank you, Jim. We are running out of time, and I have 7 questions lined up. So what I will try to do is to read 3 questions.
Sure.
And then maybe you answer the easiest one to you.
Well, 2 of them are about evil thoughts, and you have to remember that I have a sense of humor. It's what do you do with them? They're data, but don't imagine that you're seeing evil things. But go ahead.
All right. So the first question on my list here is from Francis Falako, Nigeria. Thanks to you for that lecture. I'm bothered about handling respondents who seem difficult. So your take on that. The next question is from Josiah Taru from Zimbabwe. The question is, how do we avoid going native? Also, how do we maybe navigate, portray what we observe and our social standing? If you want to respond to that with each of them 1 sentence or 2, then I can.
Okay. Respondents are going to be difficult. You're going to be difficult. I mean, it's part of treat them with as great respect as you can. And, just be thankful you're not married to them. I mean, human beings are human beings. I mean, we're just that, I wouldn't worry about that one so much. Don't expect everything to be easy. Expect people to challenge you. And I'll say, well, what the hell are you doing here? I get that a lot. How do we avoid going native? That was the big fear for anthropologists up through the beginning of the 1980s. That's why Frank Cushing's picture is in all of the American Introduction to Anthropology books, because people thought he went native because he wouldn't tell the Bureau of Indian Affairs everything he found out, which basically means he would refuse to be a total spy. I'm not so worried about that. How do we navigate our portrayal of what we observe and our social standing? That's a really good question, because we've got a friend of mine, Ben Zablocki, does research on religious groups, ethnography on religious groups. And he says, you have to be a serial convert in order to do work on, but then you have to be a serial apostate in order to write it up. And what you have to do is to make sure that you have written it, stayed so close to the data and written it so accurately that if they don't like what you said, then they may say, as someone did to Zablocki, well, we wish that weren't true, but unfortunately it is.
Thank you, Jim. Oh,
yeah.
Are you done?
I am. I'm just going to say to Abimbola, I'm going to put an article that speaks directly to that in the Dropbox for you. It has to do with 8 levels of representation in every ethnographic encounter. It's by Sean Landris. It's in the Personal Knowledge and Beyond book, but he goes into exactly that question of how people try to shape or manipulate what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for taking care of Abimbola's question. So we have on the line, and this will be the last batch, Rachel, Reko, Kiyama, and Okello. Would you want to look at the questions and then take whatever question is not captured? We can take it over to tomorrow when you have an hour to.
All right.
Yes.
I'm not finding that one here.
Okay. Let me read Rachel's question. What is the minimum period for an ethnographer to spend on a research site?
Long enough to have the experience of, oh my God, I didn't understand anything when I first got here. Everything I expected is different. There's no easy, you can't plan that one. You can do interview projects that you can set a time limit for, but you can't do the deep hanging out that ethnography needs. So if you haven't got tons of, if you only got 2 months, fine, do an interview project. There's nothing wrong with that, but don't call it ethnography.
Thank you for that. So the other question from Kiyama, I think you answered the evil thoughts already. So the Kiyama question from Kenya, we've talked about the value of developing useful distance from the research object. As researcher in particular places in Africa, we have certain things we experience that are part of the shared worldview or hidden worldview at a broader level in our context. Many of your examples are of Westerners studying non-Western cultures. Many of us are Africans studying realities in our own context. Would you comment and share some of your thoughts about it? I know you would do a paper on this as well.
Okay. Well, most of my research, my own research, has been in North America, working with North Americans. The Japanese church was one of those that was different, although half of the people in it were Anglo rather than Japanese Americans. So there's a level on which it's not all that different. There's a saying in anthropology that you need to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And can you in Africa make Africa strange? And I think the answer is yes, but you also aren't necessarily polluted with the colonial presuppositions that were in place in the early, particularly the British African social ethnography in Africa. One element, for example, was that in the colonial period, wars were suppressed. And so everyone, all of the early British social anthropologists were functionalists. They were stasis people. They were describing places that were static, where that wasn't what was going on at all. And it wasn't until people started the same, those ethnographer students started going to New Guinea and finding a completely different social structure, did they realize, oops, what we were seeing in Africa was a result of colonial imposition, and we didn't take colonialism into account. You're not going to have that problem. But there's no reason you can't do it in your own society. You have to be a little careful. It's harder doing it with people. I'll give you an easy example. I'm Quaker. I can't interview Quakers. I would never do a research project among Quakers because I think I know what they're going to tell me. And so I'm not going to push them hard enough in an interview. The best books about Quakers have been written by Jesuits. And so try to stay out of your own tradition. You'll see more. But talk to people. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Jim. We are out of time, but I just would use my prerogative as moderator to squeeze in the last two questions. Any other questions, we would migrate to the session, the Q&A session tomorrow. So here's a question from Okelo Ogera, Kenya. Just wondering if the evil or holy voices one hears during ethnographic interviews are part of our biases or defense mechanism to avoid manipulation of your research. How best can one deal with this, bearing in mind insider-outsider perspectives?
Yeah. Well, that could be the case. What I was suggesting is simply writing them down and not presuming that you know what they are until after you've looked and found a pattern. Because they may be nothing. I mean, you know, the inner voices you get may be the fact that your breakfast didn't quite digest well enough. And so maybe it's just chance. I would, you write it down as data, recognizing that it may not be useful data, and you may just end up ignoring it.
Thank
that
you.
Keeps you from presuming that you know what it is.
All right, thank you. So the last question on this round is from Felix, Malawi. He asks, would you say that reflexivity decolonizes ethnography, that is, avoids ordering? How can ethnography, I guess he meant, be used to decolonize or decenter Eurocentric perspectives?
It's a step toward decolonizing. It's not sufficient in and of itself. And I need to write down yet another article to stick there, which is the presidential address for the Research Committee 22 that I did in 2018, which explicitly uses the ethnographic process of reflexivity as a parallel to what theorists have to do in order to decolonizing or decenter Eurocentric theorizing. It operates, it's the same process, but it's operating at a different level. Just the kind of ethnographic reflexivity isn't enough, because you could still be taking along baggage, intellectual baggage. But there is a particular decentering of Euro-American theory that needs to happen, that's a parallel process, and I write about it there.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, I'm a bit constrained here with time, but we have one final one. Maybe it's just a comment, and we'll read it. Don't worry, we've eaten 10% of the break time. We will recoup it, so we'll try to add it, if you don't mind, to the next session. So this is a question from Edson. Mozambique. And we have a Google translation of that. Hopefully it captures it. Africa has the advantage of being multicultural. African countries are composed of different people's ethnic cultural groups. In this sense, we are always strangers and with many things to learn from each other. We are also very close because there are connections and there are no pure cultures, pure traditions. Yes, so this is not a question, but it's a commentary. Jim, may you
A
have
very
anything?
wise commentary,
Yes.
a very good commentary.
Yes, thank you, Jim, and thanks, Edson, for that commentary, which really helps to bring us to the reality of our diversity, our complexity, but also sometimes the possibility to look at what is common in the face of these complex diversities. I would like to therefore use this opportunity to thank all those who raised questions and comments, and also the brilliant responses from the facilitator. And if you don't mind, I think we should give Jim another round of double clap offering.
Thank you very much.